Oh, hi. This
Hello.
is always sort of surreal to be interviewing someone in person that I've just talked to on the phone or in Zoom, so I'm still kind of adjusting. That's very cool. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, so founder journey. Tell us about when you first started Brex. I believe you were in your early 20s?
Yeah, so the founding story, in a quick way, is born and raised in Brazil. And out of high school, I started a payments business in Brazil that did payment processing, so kind of like Stripe of Brazil. And then after selling that company, moved to the US to go to college, and then dropped out to start Brex in fintech. Actually, the first idea that we got into YC wasn't actually in fintech. It was a VR company.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Because when we sold the last company, we were tired of fintech. We're like, all these banks and regulators, it's so complicated. We're now in Silicon Valley. We want to do something the bleeding edge of technology. So VR seemed like it. A few weeks into YC, we realized we had no clue what we were doing, and decided to pivot into Brex. In Brex, the first kind of value proposition we realized was that there's all these startups that had raised millions of dollars and they couldn't get a corporate card. And we're like, that makes absolutely no sense. How can you have raised $3, $4, $5 million and still not be able to get a corporate card? That's what we decided to do early on.
Yeah, so the last time you were at Disrupt was 3 years ago. You were launching Brex Cash at that time. And there were billboards all over the city, right? You couldn't pass a bus stop without seeing Brex on a billboard. You're aggressively marketing to startups in kind of an old school way. But then earlier this year, you kind of had a shift in strategy. You announced that you were making a push into software. You're going to be focusing on the enterprise. And then this summer, you talked about no longer working with SMBs and non-professionally funded startups. Now, this kind of surprised a lot of people, upset a lot of people. Really just want to understand what led to that decision when you were born as the company that was building a corporate credit card for startups. What led to this decision and such a change in your strategy?
Absolutely. So just to explain that, it takes a little bit of history. So we started Brex corporate card for startups, right? And honestly, that is still a lot of our core business. And if you look at our revenue, the majority of the revenue comes from startups that we acquired, 5 years ago, and they became kind of like larger companies and startups that we acquire today. And then as every company, we needed to expand, right? We're doing this corporate card for startup thing. We launched Brex Cash, which is our business account for startups. Where do we go from here? And we had a couple options. We could go to, okay, we're doing Brex for startups, then we go do Brex for e-commerce, right? Another vertical. And then startups are small businesses, so why not get traditional small businesses? That was another idea. And then the third idea was like, hey, let's go into the mid-market and large companies because we had companies that started with us and scaled all the way, so let's serve them. And we had raised a good amount of capital, so we're like, why not do all of these? And I think what we realized as a founder is that in our journey is that it's really hard to do all of these at the same time. You kind of have to pick and choose, no matter how much money you raise, because it's not about the money, it's about the focus of the organization. It's about, what are your leaders spending time on? And what happened is when we started serving more traditional SMBs, right? And and it's a hard delineation between what's an SMB, what's a startup. At Brex it's very clear, but externally it's a little bit more complicated. We realized that we went from onboarding a few hundred startups every month to onboarding 5,000, 10,000 SMBs every month, and everything started breaking, and the kind of like everything that you would expect if you just multiply all their volumes by 10. And then what happened with that is we started our core customer, which was the startups. We started not serving them as well as we wanted to, because you had so many small businesses. And the ones that were growing, which is a lot of our best customers that start with us, starting to say, hey, in order for me to stay with you all the way through, I need some new features and functionality. So then as a founder, we came to this super hard moment and decision to say, okay, what do we do? Where do we focus? And we decided to focus on our core customer, which are the startups. And we made the super hard decision to offboard a lot of the more traditional SMBs in order to keep serving our core market. Because what we realized is that our value proposition for startups was number one, you can stay with us from the beginning till IPO and beyond, right? Like a lot of times, our customers, when we talk to them, they're like, look, I don't want to use a tool that I'm going to have to switch out to something more mature later. I want to go with something that can start today and stay until I go IPO and beyond. So we needed to like solve that, right? And so I think that's kind of what led us to the strategy of focusing on the startups that were growing in our base. So and focusing on the startups plus mid-market and enterprise as well.
I know, I'm curious. When Brexs, you're an early investor in the company, by the way, in case those of you didn't realize. When Brexs started contemplating this move and discussed it with you, what were your first thoughts? I mean, did you think, okay, this is a good idea, or did you have your doubts?
Yeah, no, I think, like, first of all, I think to give you all some perspective, 2020 and 2021 were very different years for pretty much every startup, right? Like the world, we were in a pandemic, we were in a remote world. And what did that mean for startups that Brex was servicing? Everything had changed. So if you look at when Brex started in 2017, pretty much all YC startups were in person. They all had less than 10 employees, they were in person. And in 2020 and 2021, startups had to be remote first. There was no other option. So now the Brex card could no longer just work for a US employee. It had to work for employees globally. So I think so it was not surprising from the sense that, they started with a core product that was exceptionally valuable. I would say, for example, when they first launched it in the YC batch, I think the first batch itself, greater than 80% of startups signed up for Brex because it was not possible to get a credit card within 24 hours in 2017, in spite of getting an investment. And fast forward 4 years later, suddenly the archetype of a startup looks different. 42% of YC startups are international. Greater than 35% of YC startups now recognize themselves as remote first off the bat. So Brex had to really adapt their startup product in 2020 and 2021. So when you have that, plus a new customer SMB, so the discussion was really, okay, let's figure out what to do one thing really well versus try and do 2 to 3 things really well, because that's just hard. So because startups are resource constrained more than capital constrained. Right? So, and when you think about where to put all your resources, it was a very honest discussion at the board level in terms of, okay, who's our core segment, and we want to continue service that segment. That segment looks different now. Their needs are different, so let's double down on that.
Okay, that's interesting. But this summer, when it did happen, and you did make the announcement, there were a lot of upset people, and I think a lot of startups, or some startups, felt kind of abandoned, or the smaller ones that you were no longer serving, because you were one of the fastest growing fintechs, right? Very, very buzzy. You made such a name for yourself in the startup world. So there were some shock waves, and I suspect you may not have expected the fallout or the backlash that you got. So tell us, like, what did you learn from that? Were you surprised by what happened? What would you do differently if you could go back in time?
Yeah, for sure. I think that probably the first mistake is that, as I said, in Brex, when we set SMB or startup, it was very different. And it was in our heads, it was very different, that those were different things. So I think the first problem was that it was very confusing who we were and who we weren't solving for. So, a few days later, we released what is the eligibility criteria. And we're hoping to get all kinds of startups, right? From, the bootstrap ones that hasn't received venture funding yet, to venture funding, to crypto, right? Like, that is the target audience that we do want and we do want to serve. And I think we should have made that more clear with the announcement. It's like, what is the eligibility criteria to stay at Brex, right? And to work with Brex. So that was probably, a big learning just in terms of how we communicated, to our customers. And then I would say, like, look, the biggest learning for me that I try to apply is sequencing instead of parallel. So try to do less things well, and focus on them, and instead of trying to catch the whole world at once.
Well, that's a valuable lesson. I think there are a lot of startups that have been in that position, trying to do multiple things at the same time. I'm a mother, I work, and I get it. When you try to do too many things at once, inevitably something's not going to go right. Something's not going to go very well. You had mentioned that everything started breaking. Can you elaborate on that? What do you mean by everything started breaking?
Well, think that all the customer support lines were taking forever, right? Imagine that. The underwriting started getting more complicated because we couldn't be super nuanced about knowing every customer. It needed to be more automated, and the more automated it was, we rejected a lot of companies that weren't supposed to be rejected.
That's interesting.
And then it just became more complicated to operate at scale. I think when we were at startups, we could literally look every startup and make a decision and understand who are the investors, what are they doing, who are the founders. When there's 10,000 of them, it's really hard to do it in a very thoughtful way. So we had to automate it, and every automation kind of fails in some way.
Okay.
So that was like a big problem. But more importantly is the convergence of roadmap didn't exist. Like a lot of the businesses were saying, hey, we want capital. We want working capital loans. We want loans so we can build out my restaurant or build out my flower shop. And startups were telling us we want global, right? Like remote was happening, and people were hiring anywhere. They were telling we want spend management because we're now growing and we have more employees. We need to control spend. We want a bunch of different things that the roadmaps completely diverged from the small business roadmap. So that's why it was really hard.
Yeah, I think obviously the pandemic changed a lot of things. A lot of people had to adapt and pivot in ways that they never expected. So when you started out, did you imagine that like a few years later that you would be in this situation with such a different roadmap, a different strategy, moving into software, focused on enterprise? Earlier this year you announced DoorDash was one of your earliest customers. Like, how did you handle such a pivot?
Yeah, for sure. So, before the pandemic, Pedro and I, we not only didn't allow remote work, we were anti-remote work. We did not believe it was a viable option for companies. 6 months into the pandemic, we announced that Brex is going to be remote first forever. So, talk about someone changing their mind completely.
Yeah.
And I think what we saw with the pandemic is a lot of times the best kind of like business opportunities, they happen when there is a platform shift, right? So people, talk about the creation of computing, right? And how that platform shift. And then we came to the internet, and then we came to mobile. And we're hoping for VR. Pedro and I are not going to do it, but hopefully Meta does. But we believe that this shift to distributed work is the next platform shift. And if you still believe remote or in office, like that's a whole debate. I'm not even going to get into it. But companies are not saying, I'm going to hire in one place anymore, because it's clear from the pandemic that there is talent everywhere. People are moving everywhere. And when there is this kind of like massive shift in the world, that creates a lot of opportunity for businesses like Brex to create solutions for the changing world, right? So as Anu said, as more companies go remote first, everyone needs to have now stipends and have lunch in the office. How do you make a really good product to make stipends work really well, right? As companies hire globally, they need to reimburse employees globally. Like, how do we do that so you can send money all around the world, right? So all these kind of, as travel came back not in the same way. Before, travel was all about the road warriors who were visiting their customers, right, in person. Now, a lot of travel is about seeing your own coworkers.
True.
So as all the world changes, it kind of like creates a lot of opportunities. So we need to pivot the business to take advantage of customer demand, right, and to build what our customers want.
I get that, but how does that translate into the enterprise shift and then the software, software focus?
For sure. So the way I think about the Brex business is, I think that the first part of our journey, is what I call the enablement, right? The first thing you need to do is, you didn't have a card, we need to give you a card. You didn't have a bank account, we'll give you a business account. You didn't have cards, or you couldn't reimburse people, in the US or globally, we're going to allow that to do for you, right? And that is the first iteration of our business, and still something that we're building to today. But the next step is, hey, how do I make sure now your company grew a little bit, that all of your spend is compliant and tax compliant, budget compliant, policy compliant, right? Like, how do you make sure that the spend is going to the right place? That is a software issue. That is like, how do we not build now financial fintech and financial infrastructure like we did for the enablement, but how do we build software to help employees and empower employees and make sure they're compliant? And if we can do it in a really smart way, right, we can accelerate companies a lot because it's just easier for everyone to do that around the organization. And that's a big shift in business model. Because now the buying is now, I'm not just buying something that I didn't have, now a lot of times we're replacing something, right? And that requires a whole new motion as a company to figure that out.
Can I add something to that?
Please,
I
yeah.
think that, you know, when Henrique went through YC in 2017, early 2018, he had, I remember this vividly, he and Pedro had many arcs of product and roadmaps laid out. And so this question of, do we want to service the startup as they grow and scale? And so DoorDash is a YC company that scaled and went public, was there. It was more sequencing, which was, should we do first the late stage product or should we first do the SMB product? And at that time, I remember in 2018, when you all launched publicly, like the number one thing on the wait list or people who were waiting to sign up and get activated were SMBs. And so the call that time was, okay, we're servicing startups really well and we have these hundreds of thousands of SMBs, so let's do that first. But when the world shifted in 2020, where startups were going remote, and the early cohorts of Brex customers are now scaling, you know, the demand from those customers was very strong, and so they made the call. So it was never like totally new pivot. The product and the plan and the roadmap was there well in 2018.
Interesting. Yeah. Earlier today, I also talked to a couple of other CEOs in this space, Eric Lyman from Ramp, Tejo Kote from Airbase. In general, it's become a much more crowded space, right? I feel like every month I'm hearing about new players. Rippling is now in spend management. Trip Actions went from just travel to overall expenses. How did all this increased level of competition impact your strategy, you know, moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, as any founder, right, competition changes the market and you need to adapt. And I think that, you know, as we started Brex, we were solving this problem of like people can't get a card. And we solved that problem. And now, you know, other people got inspired by that idea and, you know, are solving a similar problem. So you need to evolve and adapt after that. And I think that, you know, look, it's such a massive market, right? If you think about spend management globally, right, corporate cards globally, it's such a massive market, and each company is approaching it in its own unique way. So I will separate our competitors in kind of two buckets, right? So one bucket is, you know, people whose their entire business is doing what we're doing. And each of us is trying to go to a different angle, you know, and you know, obviously we think our solution is much better, but we're a little bit biased. And then there's the people who are doing this as an add-on, right? Like just one of like 20 products that they're doing. I would say that it looks a lot easier from the outside than from the inside to do a card. It seems that with the rise of Marqeta or Stripe issuing, it's very easy to now issue a card, but there's a lot more that goes into it. So it's very easy to start and have a marketing page, but it's very hard to actually scale and get meaningful traction on the card. And we had many, you know, that didn't get any traction between Expensify or Stripe that launched cards, and we haven't seen any disruption to our market there. So, but in the end of the day, I think competition makes you focus, right? Like, I think that if you don't have good competitors, right, it doesn't push you to make it better for your customer every single day. So I think that
It's healthy.
honestly, Brex is a lot better customer because we have competitors now.
So just last week, I wrote about a decision that you made as a company that to lay off about 11% of your staff. It was, I think, 136 people, if I remember correctly. And if I understood correctly, that was in part due to your decision to stop serving SMBs. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I think that one of the things I'm most interested in is earlier this year, you know, you were valued at $12.3 billion, making you a decacorn. I mean, you've grown, you know, an incredible rate since you first started. How did it feel to go from like raising hundreds of millions of dollars at this very high valuation to having to lay off staff?
Yeah, so obviously it's an incredibly hard thing to do as CEO and founder. Like, if you think about the journey of being a CEO and founder, this is the worst part. You know, like, I can tell you there's a lot of hard stuff, but this is the worst of them. And I think that, you know, the world, again, good companies, they are companies who see reality and adapt to the environment. And we had both the business model shift that you mentioned that, you know, was part of the reason. But second is, you know, in a world in which now profitability is, you know, and a path to profitability is very important, you need to be able to make decisions like these and focus on getting there. So, you know, we did what we had to do to keep a sustainable business, and, you know, it was super hard, but hopefully, you know, we felt we did very well for the people who left, and, you know, we appreciate them a lot.
Are you doing any other things to help, I guess, minimize cash burn? I mean, do you still have a lot of runway? And I know, before I forget also, I'd love to hear, are you seeing a lot of other companies go through similar trimming as well?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to. I graduated 2001 and 2009, so those were the 2 times I graduated, and I know how difficult those macro cycles were. I was one of the candidates in 2001, even before my job started, that was laid off. Look, layoffs are very tough decisions. I mean, the macro environment that we are in right now, and that we will be at least in early 23, is so far all the signals are way worse than the last 5 years. So as companies and founders, our advice to companies is you have to make the hard decisions sooner. And sometimes the hard decisions are usually, you know, double down and focus on one thing. And second is building a very sustainable business that gives you the right to come through on the other side, to make new bets or have the capital to grow. So from that lens, I mean, you've seen already the press, which is, you know, companies have had to make hard decisions. And I'm sure it's not something they wake up and take that in a very like relaxed way. It's very deliberate and well thought through, and it's hard. But I think the macro environment is quite different than anything we've seen. I mean, we often say in YC that some of our companies that started in 2009 have not seen a recession until now, right? It's the first time. So, but the positive thing in this is, I always tell, you know, companies and founders, what doesn't kill you only makes you strong. So the most important thing is do right by our customers, use the least amount of capital to do the right thing, and then come out on the other side and then take the right to grow.
Which brings back, I'm sorry, that's actually a good segue into my question for you. What are you doing to preserve runway? What other measures are you taking to minimize cash burn right now?
Yeah, for sure. I think in general, right, like every company right now is going through this exercise of looking at cost. Mm-hmm. And that actually is a massive tailwind for Brex, because last year, if your product didn't help grow revenue, you didn't get the time of day. Now, I think as a product that helps you manage costs and understand how you're spending the money across your company, especially as you scale, you know, we are getting on the time of day in terms of a lot of new acquisition. I think that, look, in terms of the biggest cost in a startup is headcount. I would say we don't have very aggressive hiring plans anymore, and, you know, obviously we did this layoff, so those are probably the biggest measures. And I think as a remote first company, we also have very little offices, so that's also very helpful. And then I think that probably the biggest thing that, you know, we want to do is, like, obviously to keep growing, we have to keep investing. And we're very committed to hiring everywhere in the world now. So we started doing in Brazil and Israel and Canada, but we hope to hire in a lot more countries. And I highly recommend for any founders, there are so many talented engineers all over the world. So if you haven't started hiring globally, like, that's something that I highly, highly recommend you doing. You know, a lot of times you have people that are, you know, cheaper, that live even better because the cost of living is lower, work really hard, and are really smart and talented. So,
We've got a lot of Q&A here, so I just have one more question, then I want to get into Q&A. What are your plans for Empower, which is your new software product? And I know you talked about DoorDash, but can you talk about any other enterprise customers that you've landed since then?
Yeah, for sure. So today we're also announcing that we're deploying Coinbase, which is one of the companies I admire the most that pioneered crypto in the US, and definitely also YC company. There's SeatGeek, Built, and a couple other enterprise customers. There's a lot of them, but we need to get some authorization to talk about them. So more on that coming soon. And I think in terms of Empower, right? If you think about what we're doing, as I said, we focus a lot of enablement and doing more of that globally, right? So making sure all of our products now work for companies that are globally and multinational, that's a big priority for us. And in the compliance piece I was talking about is like, how do we make it extremely easy to be compliant? How do we automate receipts so no one has to do receipts anymore? Because I always lose my receipts.
Yeah, we all hate receipts.
Yeah, everyone hates receipts. How do we automatically approve things that are in policy? How do we make it super easy for employees to know even what is the policy, right? Like, how do we route, how do we make stipends super easy so people are not approving the same stipends every month because it's already there. So we're making it extremely easy for employees and finance leaders to make the company compliant, which is kind of what we're focused on in Empower right now.
Okay, cool. So we have 13 minutes left. Let's dive into some of these questions. Someone wants to know, what's the biggest mistake you made at Brex?
Well, we probably covered it, was trying to do too much at the same time with trying to take all these markets at the same time.
Okay. Someone else wants to know that they're asking if you can share a story from your early days where you made a big, bold ask from someone and actually got it.
Anu, do you have any?
I do. I have many stories of, one of the things I would say that both Henrique and Pedro are exceptionally good at is fast learners, so extremely fast learners. So one thing I remember from the batch, we told them, I think Dalton, actually their group partner, said, well, if you're pivoting to a fintech company and you're launching this, it would be great if you can go get Max Levchin's endorsement if he actually believes in this idea. And I remember we were like, they came from Brazil. They have no idea of anything in Silicon Valley. But I remember this very well. They wanted to learn how to interview engineers in the US because they had only hired in Brazil. So they went through the recruiting, career services of recruiting for a firm at Stanford, went through the full recruiting process to learn how companies hire here, got the offer, told them that they want to meet Max Levchin before they decide. And of course, the team introduced them to Max Levchin. They pitched Brex, and they got angel investing from Max.
That is a true story.
That's just, I have many such stories, but that just tells you how resourceful and deliberate they are with and their ability to learn.
I have a question also specifically geared toward you. How do you at YC support startups like Brex when they scale from 0 to 1 and then from 1 to scale?
So yes, I help lead the Continuity Fund for those of, along with Ali Rogani, for those of you that are not familiar. Continuity was launched 7 years ago within YC. We do two things. One is, double down in a select subset of YC companies that are breaking out. And two, we actually help them, we run the post-batch YC programming. So for companies that are scaling, what we really focus on is helping them with company building. So, especially when the CEO is managing 30 employees and going from 30 to 100 or 200, it's pretty much the first time they're managing that many people. So what we do is really helping them focus on how to hire senior leaders, how to onboard them, how to do performance management, compensation philosophy. But we're really using the collective knowledge of the YC community, the scaled YC founders who share their learnings and lessons. So that's really where we focus.
Another question that I thought was interesting. Brex is in part known for kind of what you might describe as flashy marketing. We talked about the billboards, yacht parties. I think you had a cafe at one point.
We did.
Yeah, right.
I visited today, actually.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. But you no longer.
No, not anymore.
So the actual question is, why is that kind of spending worthwhile amidst a market downturn?
Well, most of the let's separate into two. So there's the stuff we did in the early days, and there's the stuff we do now. In the early days, the famous story is that we actually bought almost every billboard in San Francisco. And because there's actually not a lot of people buying billboards, everyone only wanted to do it Google and Facebook ads because it was so easy to track conversion rates and measure. We actually bought most of the billboards in San Francisco for 3 months for $300,000.
$300,000?
$300,000, yeah.
Wow.
Which, may seem like a lot of money. We had raised around $60 million at the time, so it wasn't huge for us, but it was massively successful. We definitely got way more than that in revenue in the first month that we did that. And obviously billboards got more, maybe they're cheaper now actually after the pandemic, but obviously like billboards, and then after we did it, a lot of people did it, so it got more expensive. So I think like every time coming up with like, what are people not doing, right? Like what are the opportunities that not everyone is doing right now? Because if everyone is doing it, then it doesn't work. So we were always trying to do new things. Some of them worked, some of them didn't work. The cafe clearly after the pandemic didn't work. So, but you got to keep trying stuff, and some of them do. I think these days, look, Brexs is extremely structured in terms of budgets, CAC, paybacks, and a lot of when we talk to our startup customers, they always say that community is one of the most important things for them. It's like they love being a Brex customer because of the community of Brex customers. So, doing events and parties and things that put the community together is core part of our strategy, and it's what it's one of the ways we differentiate and build relationship with our customers. So, one thing as a startup is like, as much as you'd like, you can't save your way to a successful startup. You need to invest and you need to do things. You just need to be thoughtful, right? And make sure that the money is going to the right places and it's not being wasted.
Well, and we touched on earlier all these competitors, and one of the questions here is, or statement, ramp better than Brex, why is this statement false? I'd like to expand that to maybe a little bit more generally. Why would you say that, what makes Brex so much better, in your view, than all these other offerings? Or I guess why do you believe that Brex is so much better than all these other offerings?
Yeah, for sure. So I would say that I would separate in 2 segments. So let's start with startups, and then I'll go to kind of like more mid-market enterprise. For startups, I would say Brex is best for one, you can have all in one place, right? So you have your credit cards, you have your business accounts, you have bill pay, you have expense management, you have venture debt, you have financial modeling, all integrated in one place, right? So it's super easy to have everything in one place, easy to start, easy to manage. So that's number one. Number 2 is we can go with you from the beginning till IPO plus. Like I told you about DoorDash, I told you about Coinbase, Scale AI started when there were 2 people. Now they're, I think close to 1,000 still with Brex. Flex Sports started out pretty small, also a couple thousand people, right? So if you start with Brex, you can scale all the way through. I think a lot of our competitors, we see people churning off of them as they grow as well. And then number 3 is global. Brex has a massive commitment to global companies, right? Like that's a big journey. It's a complicated problem. So if you are a startup or a mid-market enterprise company and you plan on hiring outside of the US, you plan on having operations outside of the US, there's no competitor of Brex right now that's investing more in making that successful. So I would say that's probably like the 3 for the startup world, the 3 reasons I would describe as kind of the differentiators of Brex.
Okay, two other quick questions related to that answer. One, who would you say is a Brex competitor? And then you talked about global company. Do you believe post-pandemic, now that remote is still a thing, but not quite what it was, that it's still viable to create a global company from anywhere, or does it really make a difference for the founder for an employee to be US based? Sorry, 2 questions at you at the same time. But.
Yeah, so I'll start with the second one, which is if you're going to start a company. The first one is easy. So who is the Brex competitor? So we actually, in fintech, we have a lot of frenemies. I think that's like the thing. So if you think about all the banks, right, and all the fintech companies, they all work with each other, and at the same time, they all use each other too.
Right.
Right. So JP Morgan has a corporate card, but we use JP Morgan for a bunch of stuff. And I think that is, we Concur is somewhat of a competitor to us on spend management, but we also integrate with Concur, for customers that are joint customers, right? So in fintech world, you have a lot of people who kind of overlap in parts of the process, right? Or Rippling is the other example that you mentioned that, launch like Jakarta and spend management, but they're a great integration partner for HRIS. So it's something that's pretty common in our industry, and it's something you have to learn how to deal with if you're doing it. In terms of like where to start, look, I would say that I believe in a world that no matter where you were born, you can have the same economic opportunity if you're born in Silicon Valley, right? But I don't think we're there yet. I was born in Brazil, and I got to the point of my company in which I had to decide, do I sell my company and move to the US to try to go big there, or do I stay here and build this company? And I believe that in order to be successful, I had to be here. And I think that's definitely the trend is going the other direction now. Many successful companies are being started from many places in the world, and I hope Brex can be a part on pushing that shift forward, because I do want to leave a world to my kids where that is true, and you can start a company from everywhere and be as successful as starting here in the US.
I'd add that from YC standpoint, I would say, I still think when you're starting out a company like scratch, there's benefit to being in person, because you're brainstorming and you don't even have a product that works, and you need to get it to work and talk to users and figure out if you have early signs of some product market fit. Is that a company to be built? But once you get to around 100, 150 employees, it's really hard to scale in Bay Area. That was true even in 2018, pre-pandemic, right?
We opened the New York office at 80 people.
Yeah, and if there's another YC company, Fair, which is scaled really well. They have around 350 engineers. Any guesses how many are in the Bay Area? 3. So I think more startups will start globally, just because there are amazing engineers working on startups everywhere. So there'll be more companies that start everywhere. But when you're starting, no matter which part of the world you're in, it helps to be in person. As you're scaling, you inevitably, I think, in the future, are going to have to find a way to scale remotely, or have some part of your organization remote.
We only have 2 minutes, and I am under strict orders not to go over time. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll have to wrap it up. There's a number of them here. No, I'm wasting time. As young founders, I think this is really interesting. As young founders, how did you convince experienced engineers to join Brex?
I think that we've been building companies since we're 14. So we get that question for a long time. And I think that what's important when hiring people that are more experienced than you is you think that a lot of the convincing is like, oh, my company will be successful. And there's obviously some of that. But a lot of times, senior people, they want to feel impact. They want to feel that they actually going to come in and you're going to listen to them. And the reality is, when we started our first company, we were 16. The only option we had was listening to them. We didn't know anything else. Like, how else would we know? So I think we have this culture of, when we go to hire senior people, engineers or non-engineers, what we say is like, look, you can make a real difference here. Like, we will listen to you. We will push back, but we will listen to you, and you will have impact, and we will build this company together. And I think that's probably like when you're young, you're just thinking that you're just trying to convince everyone that you're right and that the company is going to be successful. But just as important is convincing them that they're going to be a great partner to you and you're going to grow together and build this company together.
Okay, well, we made it. 30 seconds left. Thank you both so much for being here, answering all of these questions. Thank you all for attending and all of your great questions. Have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.